Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Samantha Politics. I'm delighted to be here. We have an exciting show coming up today. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive on Brazil as Brazil's government is tumbling, the economy is in free fall, and the coronavirus crisis has spiraled out of control. We have an amazing guest, Gabrielle Trabat from McLarty Associates. I want to do a couple world updates before we bring her in, and then we're going to dive right into Brazil. So I know this is going to shock you, but there was another attack at the Capitol. Unbelievable. And this is also incredibly shocking. 25-year-old white male. I know, really incredibly hard to believe. This time he rammed into the Capitol building, rammed into two police officers and then came out of his car brandishing a knife where he was shot dead. He unfortunately was able to kill one of the Capitol police officers that was a veteran of the force. Really, really sad day. Capitol Police force has been extremely shaken up, especially this being the second time it's happened. And it's also called into question, how close can people really get to the Capitol building? As someone who lives only a couple blocks away from the Capitol, it's like incredibly beautiful, but I think it's become incredibly clear that congresspersons are domestic terror targets. It's pretty scary to hear that, but they are targets from domestic terrorists. And so there may be fencing and roping off, and you may not be able to climb on those beautiful pearly white steps anymore. Just kind of a sad reflection on the state of affairs and the level of domestic extremism that we have to watch out for since that very first attack on the Capitol. I also want to give an update on Burma, which we've been following. It is unbelievably sad what's going on in Burma. What's exciting is people are continuing to protest. What is really troubling is that the military has really held no bars in terms of firing on civilians, and just really almost bizarre accounts of people military not even necessarily firing on protesters, but going into people's houses and shooting small children at point blank range. I mean, this is murder. Unclear what the motive is, or being snipers in a forest and killing a little girl that was out getting a coconut leaf that was nowhere near a protest. So it's become this large scale campaign of terror by the military that goes far beyond just murdering people that are protesting. You are seeing some military defect. They're actually becoming refugees and going towards the border of Thailand and India. So this is going to create huge refugee flows. It already has. You also have the Rohingya that were already displaced, becoming double displaced. It's not a good state of affairs in Burma. And what's really troubling is that the military is showing no signs of letting go. There is some hope that as the economy starts to tank, which it already is, that maybe the military will loosen up because they'll see that, they may, if they kill everyone, there's no country left. If they ruin the economy, there's not really a country left. But unfortunately, with especially men that are really trying to hold on to power in these types of military they're essentially now a kind of military dictatorship again situations. It's incredibly hard to convince them to let go of power. They're so invested in having that power and keeping that. Aung San Suu Kyi was also just lobbied another bunch of charges at her for totally arbitrary things. But it is inspiring to see the Burmese people just still out there protesting and not wanting to go back to a military dictatorship. So we'll keep you updated as that story unfolds. So Zach, if you could put up that picture of an elf. So this is definitely the first time I've had a picture of an elf on my show. Why is that? Well, a couple weeks ago, we covered Argentina and how Argentina is the biggest Latin American country to have finally legalized abortion. But what does that look like in practice? So turns out legalizing abortion doesn't necessarily matter if no one's willing to provide it. And so one of the issues now that abortion is legalized is that there's a lot of obstetricians that are just saying, I'm not going to do it. So especially in the rural areas of Argentina, the remote areas, it's still really hard to get an abortion because no one wants to do it. And there's reports of healthcare providers telling women things like, if you have an abortion, your fetus will turn into an elf. I literally have no idea. It's like, these are the lengths that they're willing to go to try to get women. It's just so funny. It's like so far from believable that it's just like, that's all you got. That's all you have to convince in someone not to get an abortion. It's just so freaking bizarre. So I think it just calls into question, you can have a legalization, but then what happens when there's no providers? I think I may have mentioned on Guam, for example, Guam, abortion is legal, but very, very Catholic, and there's not a single abortion provider on the island of Guam. So what was happening? Women were flying to go somewhere else to get abortions. But what happened when COVID? The country shut down, or excuse me, the territory shut down, and you couldn't get out to go get an abortion somewhere else. So all of a sudden, no abortions. And it's because it's a highly Catholic country, and it just providers won't provide them. So it shows, even if it's legal, and what a lot of states in the US have done is, it's not illegal to have an abortion, but they introduce all these restrictions that make it really impossible for abortion clinics to survive, or for people to be able, for doctors to be able to provide abortions, because they have to have corridors that are as wide as a hospital. They have to be connected to a hospital. They have to have elves on the shelves. I mean, I don't even know, like arbitrary stuff that has nothing to do with that. So just something to really think about in terms of policy. And when policy becomes law, it doesn't necessarily mean that trickles down into practice. So Zach, if you could just put up that map of Brazil. So we're going to move this week to Brazil, to Latin America, which we haven't covered that much. Brazil's COVID crisis is out of control. They have the variant, but it's not just about the variant. It is that it has been unbelievably mishandled by the President Bolsonaro, who I like to call Trump 2.0. What is going on there? So Zach, if you could just put up that chart. So it has now surpassed, on Tuesday, 4,195 deaths from COVID in Brazil in one day. The total tally of people infected is over 13 million. And deaths are almost at 337,000 people in Brazil. Guess which country has only had more deaths? I know, shocking as usual, the United States, which is at 556,000 deaths. Now, it's really a terrifying situation in Brazil. The health system, some people are saying it's collapsed already. People are saying it's on the brinks of collapse. They're running out of anesthesia, intubation drugs. There's actually ambulances that are sitting outside of hospitals with the patients, but there's nowhere to put the patients because the ICU beds are all full and the hospital's not accepting any more patients. Can you imagine getting in an ambulance and getting to the hospital and then being like, oh, just kidding, no room for you, like hang out in the ambulance for a while. There's, oxygen tanks that are located in one room and the lines being fed through a courtyard to patients in the hallway. What's really scary too is that apparently it hasn't even necessarily reached the peak yet, especially with this new variant. As of late on Tuesday, 23 out of Brazil's 27 federations reported an ICU occupancy rate of 80% or more. Of those, 15 have either collapsed, or on the verge of collapsing with ICU occupancy over 90%. And so, like I pointed out, and Zach, you can put up that Brazil slideshow now, and you see Jair Bolsonaro, the president. He has just been basically a blockade to Brazil doing anything moderately effective with regards to COVID. He's refused to implement social distancing. He's refused to implement mask wearing mandates. He's even said that locking down would be counterproductive because it would make people more vulnerable to the virus if they're at home. And he even said something that like healthy people are not going to die as much, and people aren't working out at home, so therefore they're going to die more. And then he said that he was even getting a belly. I mean, like, it was just like so arbitrary and not based on any scientific fact whatsoever. He's also been, like Trump, championing drugs that are not proven to work at all, and also can actually be harmful. They can hurt your liver. So, for example, remember that famous drug hydroxychloroquine that Trump was, talking on and on about, talking about it as a treatment for COVID-19 and a preventative medication. He even said that if he had taken it as a preventive measure, he would still be working after he contracted COVID in July. It has gotten so bad that he is literally being referred to as genocidal, okay? That like his neglect, his abject neglect is actually genocidal. I mean, that is a strong statement. That is an incredibly strong word, and psychopathic by the governor of Sao Paulo. This is the president. I mean, we called Trump a lot of things, but I don't think anyone ever called him genocidal. Like, that's pretty strong language. So amidst all this, he decides it's a great time to fire his defense minister, because that's what he should be focused on, is firing his defense minister right now. So he fires the defense minister. This was last week, March 30th. We reported on this briefly. And then the heads of the Air Force, Army, and Navy all resigned in tandem, though it seemed as if they were forced out. He also replaced his justice minister, his chief of staff, and the lawyer who represents the executive branch in cases before the Supreme Court. You can see why I call it Trump 2.0. Like, Trump just, hey, today's a new day. I'm going to fire these 5 people. They're pissing me off. Now, this is not a good time to shake up a country that's in desperate need of help. I mean, it is desperate for help and solutions for COVID and healthcare and stability. And he is just choosing the wrong time to do all these sorts of things. Something else that's been kind of interesting is that, people are starting to wonder, and we're going to talk to our guest about this, is this kind of a political coup that's happening? Is he trying to consolidate power? And in the past, he's actually basically said that the coup that brought into a military dictatorship in 1964 was a good thing, that it brought in a period of stability or something, even though the dictatorship was incredibly brutal. It had torture, disappearances, the murder of 9,000 people, including children, and those are just the numbers that we know. So what the heck is going on in Brazil? I mean, this nascent democracy is just tumbling, and is it going to stay a democracy? So I'm super excited to have an amazing guest with us today to help us understand what is going on in Brazil. Gabrielle Trabat is the managing director of the Brazil and Southern Cone practice at McLarty Associates. She brings over 20 years of experience working with governments across Latin America to promote opportunities for increased trade and investment. Prior to McLarty, she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Business Affairs and Public Liaison at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. She's also a dual national of Brazil and the United States, and previously served as executive director of the Brazil-U.S. Business Council at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where she was responsible for promoting bilateral trade and investment relationship with investors in Brazil. She's also been the director of the global program at the Council on Competitiveness, and she worked for Senator Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut from 95 to 97, and also assisted on the Gore Lieberman presidential campaign in 2000. She has a BA from Duke and an MA from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, CIPA. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in Gabrielle. Hi.
Hi, Samantha. It's a pleasure to be on your show. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm delighted to have you, to have someone with such expertise. So first of all, did I get all that right? What did I miss?
Well, it was a pretty sweeping panorama you painted, but not entirely inaccurate, unfortunately, Samantha. In Brazil, it's been very tragic. As you pointed out, it's the fatalities that are COVID related. It's Brazil's second only to the United States, with about 300,000 souls that have been lost since the beginning of the pandemic. In the month of March alone, it was about 66,000. So they're unfortunately shattering all the wrong records, daily in Brazil right now. And, it's a confluence of factors, and it's very much like the United States, to be honest with you, the reasons why behind this. But, it's a diverse country over a wide geographical, landmass. The public health care system prior to the pandemic was already pretty strained and underfunded and decentralized in its administration. So, you add on top of that, a pandemic of the proportions that we have seen with COVID, it's just, it's crippled the system. And so, as you mentioned, in, 23 out of 27 states, ICU capacities are close to 90%. And so you have a public health system that frankly didn't have any capacity to deal with existing issues, let alone a pandemic. Much like President Trump, President Bolsonaro himself has, poo-pooed or discredited the use of masks and social distancing, and has been averse to lockdowns, and that, of course, did not help to mitigate the spread of Brazil, over the past year plus that the country's been grappling with the disease. And I should say, unfortunately continues to do so, which has created some havoc there politically for him. And now we have the variant, the P1 variant, that started in Manaus, but now has spread not just throughout the country, but throughout Latin America. There's even a few cases in the United States and Japan. That has proved to be more contagious and more deadly, including for younger people as well. So it's been a tragic state of affairs in Brazil that has led to the numbers that we're seeing right now. The vaccine rollout is happening, but it's been quite slow, and there's reasons for that I can get into. But the new Minister of Health, and there's been 4, so the 4th one was appointed just about 2 weeks ago, has pledged to begin in the month of April this month to do about 1 million doses. And Brazilians are relying heavily upon pretty much donations or very low-cost purchases of CoronaVac from China and the Sputnik vaccine from Russia. And now they have AstraZeneca as well. So.
Yeah, I've seen numbers anywhere between 2 and 8% of the population has been vaccinated.
Yeah. I expect that's going to accelerate exponentially in the next couple of weeks. That's the expectation. But there's been some delays in inputs from China for various reasons that have actually also triggered some of the political chaos. The anti-China sentiment of the Bolsonaro administration has led to delays in getting needed inputs for local production of the vaccine. And for
Gabrielle, let's slow down for a second. I want to unpack this a little bit because I think that's really interesting. So, so first of all, you're talking about kind of these tensions with China that Brazil has that are, I think, a little similar to the U.S. So what is the beef between China and Brazil that's been influencing things?
Again, a lot like the U.S. And I think over the course of our conversations, you're going to see me repeatedly making a lot of parallels between Brazil and the U.S.
So interesting.
Yeah, large, diverse democracies, multi-ethnic, multiracial societies, polarized politics. Depending on what region you are, there's different attitudes about government intervention and government interference and Big Brother. So, and with China as well, it's no exception. The Chinese influence in Latin America, not just Brazil, but Latin America, has been growing tremendously over the past couple of decades. They've made massive investments in infrastructure. They are now Brazil's #1 purchaser of commodities, 3 times the U.S., which is the next largest trading partner of Brazil. And there's been a growing sentiment, or I should say, concern about growing Chinese influence in the region, much like the U.S. And that kind of came to a head on the past few months with Brazil's 5G auction and pressure to eliminate Huawei from that competition. But and President Bolsonaro and his previous Minister of Foreign Affairs, in last week's shuffle that you mentioned, his Foreign Affairs Minister also, was toppled. So there was a total of 6 major cabinet changes. He kind of was a leading voice on this anti-China sentiment. But the problem is when China is their largest trading partner and the agribusiness industry depends a lot on China. And now with the coronavirus, Brazil now has to rely on China for inputs for the vaccine and for purchases of that. It makes the anti-China position untenable. And that's exactly what happened last week with the turn of the cabinet shuffle.
Interesting. Yeah. What is he, shuffle, firing, whatever it is, what the heck is he doing? I mean, especially at a time where the country is like on the verge of collapse and he's like, let me fire everybody.
Yeah, it's, we see this a bit in Latin America when poll numbers are down, approval numbers are down, and they're not sure what to do. They move the deck chairs, around on the ship. And so last week, and this had been rumored for some time, the Foreign Affairs Minister, Mr. Ernesto Araújo, who actually I know he served here at the embassy in D.C. for a number of years, knows the U.S. very well, has lived here for quite a while, but he was new to the position. And so the mishandling of the vaccine purchases, really the responsibility fell on him and the blame fell on him. And so when there were delays in the inputs because of, again, this anti-China sentiment, the feeling was that he had to go and he had served his mission and, time for a change. So that was the reason for him. Now, the week before, it was the 4th health minister, and the previous 3 health ministers clashed with President Bolsonaro over mask use, over vaccines, and publicly endorsing vaccines, where Bolsonaro has allowed some space for those that are vaccine skeptics, who have opposed Bolsonaro over lockdowns, with the former Minister of Health insisting on lockdowns and Bolsonaro being opposed to those. So that has led to the turmoil in the Ministry of Health. The Foreign Affairs Ministry was China related. And then the Minister of Defense was a general in the Army, and this is an important part of the conversation because President Bolsonaro himself was an Army captain, and he's very, very proud of his close relationship with the military. And not since Brazil's return to democracy in 1988 has there been so many, active and former military officers actually serving in political positions.
I just want to repeat that for 1 second. So not since the return has there been that many military serving in the government.
Correct. But Bolsonaro invited them in, and I think it worked for a little while, but the top brass of the military also started to disagree with the president's position on COVID handling, and frankly began to see the slippery slope of being viewed as an appendage of the executive branch as opposed to being an independent institution that it is. So the defense minister stepped down, or he was actually resigned because I think he refused to toe the line, if you will, on some of the president's policies on COVID. And when he was ousted, the heads of the Air Force, the Air Force, the Army, and the Marines all resigned in suit. And to be honest with you, that was actually a positive move, even though it seems a bit counterintuitive. But it showed the strength of Brazil's institutions, that the military has, refused to yield to the president and his demands, and they refused to be seen as an appendage of the executive. And it reaffirmed their own feeling that the military needs to be independent of politics. So with all this said, there is a bit of a division in the military of Brazil because the rank and file do support Bolsonaro quite a bit. But there is now oxygen you're seeing between the top brass and the president himself that's been triggered by some of the COVID handling.
I remember, again, like having these parallels to the US, I remember when Trump was first saying that he was not going to leave the White House. And there was like this, I remember having a momentary panic of like, is the military actually going to go in and take him out? And then I can't remember, a bunch of military were like, no, if he loses, if he does not leave the White House, we will take him out of the White House very nicely, but we will take him out. They were not going to join with him in his ridiculous conspiracy theories about the election. And I just remember like breathing a sigh of relief, like, thank God, like we are a democracy after all. I think that is, a really good thing.
That's a little bit like the sentiment in Brazil. And we have, the presidential reelect is the end of next year. And so, some people saw him, bringing the military closer as a way to prepare himself for perhaps not winning, and what could he do with that? And so the departure of some of the top brass from those positions, I think, was a reaffirmation that the military is going to respect democracy and Brazil's commitment to democracy, and retain their independence. So in that sense, it was a good signal. Let's just say.
What do you think about all these people that are calling for his impeachment? And that would be, I think, the third impeachment since the end of the military dictatorship.
Yes, it would be the third impeachment. That is right. It's been rumored about. I don't think we are at that point in Brazil yet. I think there's not a whole lot of oxygen for throwing a political crisis on top of a health crisis right now. And so, and frankly, again, just like Trump, President Bolsonaro enjoys, over 30% approval ratings. There's a base that will always support him. And so,
who is his base, Gabrielle?
His base, it's a confluence of factors. One, a lot of evangelical Christians who identify with his sort of family values, persona, and his commitment to upholding some of those, principles in appointment of judges, in, championing down legislation, etc. So it's evangelicals in Brazil. It's what I would say the law and order folks. So people that have been very concerned about rise in crime and public security in Brazil or two, saw in him a man that was committed to law and order. And unfortunately, that has resulted in an increase in police violence, but crime is down in Brazil. So that's the second block. The third block,
an increase in police violence of police being stronger handed on whoever.
Yeah. Right. You can imagine the narrative there. Third block is the anti-corruption, the folks that were very frustrated and frankly disgusted with some of the high levels of corruption in previous administrations, and he ran a platform of anti-corruption. And the fourth group I would say is the business class, who again kind of like President Trump here, they've been promised tax reform, and President Bolsonaro has, pushed through and made a priority a number of economic reforms that Brazil has been needing to do, has been overdue for decades. And so I think that they've been willing to, sort of look away at some other things they don't disagree with, but have voted on him for the reform agenda.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think it's really interesting to think about who's making up his base. Now, something else that I found intriguing, and we chatted about this in the lead up to this conversation, is that the former president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, has now come back onto the political stage after the courts did not convict him on corruption cases, which makes it so that he could run for office.
That's right.
But, it's like just funny. It was like, okay, this guy was basically indicted on corruption charges. He wasn't convicted, but like clearly there was some sort of corruption. Is he any better than Bolsonaro? like it seems like a sea of bad options.
Well, he actually was convicted, but had that conviction overturned about
Excuse me. Thank you for
2
clarifying.
weeks ago, which has been a bit of an earthquake here in Brazilian politics.
Why? Okay, let's stop there for 1 second. Why was it vacated? And what do you mean by it was like a firestorm?
So it was vacated because a Supreme Court judge determined that he was convicted actually by a state level court in the state of Paraná, in the city of Curitiba. And the Supreme Court decided that the state court did not have the jurisdiction to try a former president. It needed to be a federal level court. And so they vacated the state court's decision and they referred it to a federal court to decide if they wanted to take up the case again, retry him again, etc. And that decision, whether they're going to retake it or not, has not been made. But in the meantime, what it means is not only is he a free man, but he's also allowed to run for office. In Brazil, if you've been convicted of a crime, you cannot run for office. But this now makes him eligible for next year's presidential election in October 2022. So this has upended politics quite a bit in Brazil. And there was a poll actually released yesterday that showed that if the election were held today, former President Lula would garner 29% of the vote. President Bolsonaro would garner 28% of the vote, so a dead heat. But it shows the level.
But what about the other? Where are the other people?
Oh, the others are
60%.
Undecided, or there's a former justice minister under Bolsonaro that actually prosecuted Lula in the original case.
Interesting.
He garners some percentage too, and then there's undecideds and there's some other candidates. But clearly, I think the polarizing choice is can be between former President Lula and President Bolsonaro, and you cannot imagine two more different political figures. It's tough to say how a Lula candidacy could help or hurt President Bolsonaro's chances. So a lot of analysts think it actually could help his chances because it may give renewed oxygen to the criticism, backlash of the Workers' Party. Mm-hmm.
What about? I've heard that there's kind of like an up and coming AOC type in Brazil. Can you tell me about her?
Yes, I don't think she'd be ready for the election, but I should preface this by saying, women in Congress tend to be in Brazil greatly underrepresented, but there has been an uptick slowly. Right now, in the lower house, which is the House of Representatives, about 15% of the seats are held by women, and an equal amount about in the Senate. But there is a young congresswoman named Tabata Amaral who is maybe early 30s, maybe 30. And she's beginning to make waves. She actually was educated at Harvard. She comes from a very working class story. Her mother was a domestic worker. Her father was a bus driver, bus conductor.
Wow.
And she won a scholarship to Harvard and studied at Harvard. Wow. And she wants to make a change in Brazil. And so her big platform is education and making sure that every Brazilian child, has access to a quality education. But she's not shy about criticizing Bolsonaro. She's been a leading voice for his impeachment. And I think she's at the beginning of her career, but I think Brazil could use a lot of influx of new blood and new passion, especially female voices in Congress. So her emergence has been, I think, quite welcomed by many observers.
Are people kind of throwing her under the bus like they do with the Squad in the U.S. of kind of hurling insults and death threats and all those horrible things at her like there is in the U.S.?
Unfortunately, some of that does happen actually by other members of Congress, which is sad to say. But on a national scale, women because they are so underrepresented, they don't yet represent a threat, I think, to the traditional order. So I think I'll know when they're really making waves, when we start seeing some of that on the bigger
like
scale.
it's like you. I always say that, like, that I'm kind of like, I'm not doing my job right unless I piss someone off.
Yeah, yeah.
With feminism, you don't piss someone off, you're not doing it right.
Exactly. And I think in their microcosms, like in the legislative assembly, you know, on the floor, they are making some waves, but it's not enough of a presence to trigger, you know, a big national reaction yet. But hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah. Do you think there would ever be, I mean, quotas have really been the big thing that have gotten more women into Congress and Parliament across the world. Do you think Brazil would ever do some kind of quota system because 15 is pretty low?
It's very low. I don't know in Congress. They definitely have done some of this for university admittance in Brazil. And they're starting to do a little bit more. It's been kind of like in the US, a bit of a controversial topic, but I know that it is something that's it's part of the political discussion. There has been an increase at the local level, the municipal level, the mayoral level of women, and especially not just women, but Black women, as well, members of the LGBT community entering politics at the local level. And I think, you know, all politics is local. So that's an important marker for us to watch as that grows. I think
because they become the pipeline to Congress.
To Congress, exactly.
Right. Yeah. That's like incredibly exciting. It's really, really cool. Yeah. So let's go towards U.S. foreign policy now. You know, we had Bolsonaro and Trump, who were kind of very similar, and now we have a normal president in the U.S. who cares about things, for example, like climate change. And you know, you have Brazil's the Amazon, you know, burning. You saw in the slideshow, our audience, just the horrible wildfires that have happened in Brazil. So that the future of you know, relationship between Bolsonaro and Biden. What are your thoughts on how that is changing from the kind of Trump era to Biden?
I think President Bolsonaro is in the midst of doing a bit of a 180, and so unfortunately, he was the second to last head of state to recognize President Biden on his victory, but he did on the day of the inaugural send a long letter outlining, you know, very productive and very positive tone, outlining a lot of areas for collaboration, which was very well received by the Biden administration. Calls were held early on between John Kerry and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of the Environment, precisely on Brazil's environmental agenda and how the U.S. can see how the U.S. wants to encourage Brazil to. I mean, I think we assume it's global leadership in environmental management. Brazil, for many years, they've hosted, the Rio Plus 20 conference. They've been an important, global voice for the environment, and that, again, like the U.S., I think Brazil has taken a back seat to that in the past few years. But I think President Biden is coming at this with a very constructive, very pragmatic attitude. I mean, he's a seasoned diplomat and a seasoned professional. So I think, he'll put some of the misgivings aside about delays in recognizing, his presidency. They're over that, and they're looking for ways. I think the U.S. is looking for ways to constructively engage with Brazil, and I think Brazil is actually trying to respond. I know the Brazilian ambassador here, Nestor Forster, has made a tremendous effort to try to be that bridge between Brasilia and Washington on the environment. And Brazil has been invited, and President Bolsonaro has confirmed his participation on the April 22nd Earth Day Summit that the Biden administration is putting on. So I think the messages that Brazil sent at that summit will be the best signal we'll get on their approach to the Amazon and how they're going to handle this, because there are serious economic consequences for Brazil, I think, if they don't get into an alignment here with the global agenda.
Yeah, I mean, with the amount of deforestation happening, I mean, some of the things is that, he's gotten rid of a lot of regulations, Bolsonaro. Do you think that the U.S. will be able to, that prevented illegal miners from expanding? Do you think that he'll budge on these if he will re-regulate his deregulations in order to protect the environment better? Will the U.S. be able to convince him to do that, do you think?
To be honest, I think a success would be even getting Brazil back at the table. And so I think we have to fall before we
baby
start
steps.
Baby steps. So, the April 22nd Earth Day Summit, getting Brazil back at the table, getting the U.S., frankly, back at the table.
I know. Thank God.
Let's begin at the beginning here. And so if they're going to roll back, or reinstate what they've rolled back, I think that remains to be seen. I'm frankly a little bit skeptical on that. But frankly, I think at this point, a victory in the views of the White House is that, Brazil's back at the table. So let's start with that. There's been a lot of pressure from the EU on the Brazilians as well, to come back to the table and to take a constructive view about, management of the Amazon. Let's see if that starts to move the needle for them. But, not having Trump anymore as a cover, I think forces Brazil, it isolates Brazil a little bit internationally. And so I think it's forced into the table.
It's like they don't have like their bullies at the playground that they can hang out with.
Yeah.
They're like, wait, where do you go? Oh, he went to another school. What do I do now?
Yeah. Well, he got kicked out of school.
Yeah, he got kicked out of school.
Right.
What about, we talked about there was that trade deal that the EU actually refused to ratify because of Brazil and climate change. Can you talk about that a little bit? It's pretty serious.
It is serious. So this was a trade deal between the EU and Mercosur. Mercosur, of course, being the trade bloc that consists of Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. It had been 20 years in the negotiation stage. It was finalized actually in the beginning of the Bolsonaro administration. So one of the pledges that President Bolsonaro made was to liberalize Brazil's economy and to promote trade and market access. And so the Bolsonaro administration has held to their word on that. And so they finalized the EU agreement. They've done a host of other measures to reduce tariffs and to facilitate trade, with Brazil and the rest of the world. But on the EU deal, it's pending ratification, right, by all the members of the EU and the members of Mercosur. And France in particular, France and Ireland, but France in particular has been leading the charge, and not just France. I'm not going to pick on France, but leading the charge that until Brazil changes its position with respect to environmental policy, they will refuse to ratify. Now, it's a little bit more complex than that, right? Because I think the French agricultural industry never was in favor of this deal, and not just the French, the Irish, German. I mean, it's extensive. So there's behind the environmental argument, there's also a number of agricultural interests as well. They're not aligned with ratifying this trade deal, but the environment is certainly one of them. And there's real economics here at stake for Brazil. But I should say the burden or the hurdle for passing this deal is high, and it also requires approval by Argentina, which is an economic crisis right now. So I think for many reasons, a lot of people are very skeptical of this trade deal, passing in the near or even medium term.
So one thing is that, in the lexicon of kind of democracies, that I think the only places that were rated as like true democracies in Latin America are Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Chile. And Brazil is not rated in this democratic index as like a true democracy. I mean, do you feel, you're dual national of Brazil and the United States, do you feel like Brazil is a true democracy? And do you think that this is this seems like a little bit of a test to like the democratic experiment? Do you think democracy is going to last in Brazil, or is this going to?
No, I think Brazil's commitment to democracy runs deep, and I would put it in the category of those other three countries. I would. Unlike some countries, even neighboring countries, and I don't want to pick on Argentina, where the judiciary has been subject to the influence of the executive. In Brazil, through the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, through the corruption investigations of in Brazil, through Bolsonaro, and even last week's political crisis, Brazil has shown a commitment to democratic principles and to the strength of its institutions time and time again. The court system works, Congress works, they're a check on the president, and the president, the presidency does what it can do within the parameters of its powers. I have not seen any slippage of that, in Brazil since the return to democracy in 1988. And let's remember too that before 1964, Brazil was also a democracy. So it's nascent. The return to democracy is nascent, but the concept of democracy in Brazil is not that nascent.
Right. It was already there.
It was already there. So I don't have any concerns whatsoever about Brazil and commitment to democracy.
Few.
Yeah.
Yeah, really. What do you think that, in terms of the COVID crisis really just spiraling out of control and the health system collapsing, what can other countries do? Like, what could the U.S. do to help in this case?
There's been a lot of talk about that. So one of the ways is through greater U.S. funding of COVAX, right, which is the World Health Organization pool of funding for procurement of COVID vaccines for developing countries. So President Biden committed to increasing funding for COVAX, which, you know, would allow Brazil access to additional resources to purchase it. I know Brazil has made pleas, this has been in the media, to the United States for assistance in, you know, procuring Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson vaccines. I think the Biden administration is pretty clear that they're going to first prioritize, once Americans are vaccinated, Canada and Mexico, but that, you know, if there's anything after that is available, they'll look at Brazil and they'll consider Brazil's case alongside many other countries. So I think there is a long-term indirect and a short-term more indirect too through the COVAX vaccine fund. But frankly, you know, the U.S. is still struggling a lot with COVID. We're still in the midst of our own vaccine rollout. You know, there's been new variants present in this country, which are impacting younger people. And so I just don't see the U.S. in a position right now, unfortunately and tragically, to do more than it is doing.
Right. We're not standing on our own feet yet.
Yeah.
I know, it's just, I think everybody now is having this weird experience of like, it's springtime and people are getting vaccinated, but then at the same time, you know, there's surges in Michigan and Florida and these variants.
Right.
And it's like, what do we do? You know, where do we, you know, and if I'm vaccinated, like, does that protect me from the variant? People are just confused. Like, they want to live again, but then there's also a serious risk still to public health.
And there's a lot of unknowns. And we're seeing, I think, younger people in these latest surges now entering the hospitals. We're seeing, again, new variants. I think there's still not enough data on reinfection, with how the new variants are responding, I think, to some of the existing vaccines. And so, you know, we're not over this yet. I think you're right. It's springtime and it's warm. And here in DC, it was like close to 80 degrees today. I was, you know, out briefly in shorts today. It was, you know, it was welcome, but it's a little bit of a false sense of hope. And I don't want us to slide into complacency here in the United States as well, because some people are getting vaccinated and because the weather is warmer. And I think there is a bit of a danger in that.
Do you feel like, you know, so many people, I was talking to a friend of mine who's Brazilian. She was like, everyone knows is in the hospital. Like, is there a sense, does Brazil have any of the same stuff like the US, where, you know, in the US you go to Florida and Texas and they're like, what's a mask? What's a pandemic? And then you go to New York and everyone's wearing a mask on the street. Is there that geographical kind of
there
denial?
Is. Absolutely. Just like in the United States, the use of masks and social distancing has been very politicized. And so there's parts of the country that are like, don't tell me what to do. This isn't a problem. I don't see it being a problem, you know, in my town or my city. When in fact the hospitals are inundated, right? Because we don't know what's going on in these ER rooms. But they see the headlines, they see the story, but they don't feel it in their family, their community, or if they do, they have a little bit of this feeling, this ethos of President Bolsonaro, which is like, listen, and this is, I'm quoting him, this isn't my words, but some people are going to die. Everybody dies. I mean, just today he said, listen, people die everywhere. I mean, you know, move on with your life. We can't lock down.
What does that feel like as a dual national, to hear something like that for you, Gabrielle?
You know, I've been hearing it. I heard it for 4 years with President Trump. I mean, really for the past last year when he was in office. Nothing shocks me anymore. You know, President Bolsonaro is somebody that has fashioned his presidency, and he's fashioned his campaign a lot on President Trump. So I think what it makes me feel is that leadership matters. You know, and U.S. you know, influence in the world has weight, for better or for worse. And so we need to be very wise about how we choose our leaders, because impacts are felt well beyond our borders.
I'm just going to repeat that. We need to be very careful about how we choose our leaders, because impacts are felt way beyond our borders.
Yeah.
I think that's really insightful, because, I mean, people thought Trump was bad enough here, but I mean, frankly, I didn't know that Bolsonaro fashioned himself after Trump. I mean, he was like him. But looking at examples, it does make a big difference. And obviously he knew if Trump was able to be elected that he could, I mean, it seems like he has a similar base.
Very similar base, very similar base. Absolutely. So we'll see if he has the same fate as President Trump. Remains to be seen. I think that'll depend on the trajectory of COVID and the economy. I mean, to quote James Carville, it's the economy stupid. So Brazil was hoping to rebound this year to about 3% growth after a 6% contraction last year. But that was predicated upon coronavirus starting to, the curve starting to flatten and vaccines starting to ramp up. And this new variant is throwing a big curveball in those plans. So there has not yet been a revision of those projections yet. So right now, the central bank and others are still planning on about 3%. But if, unemployment has ticked up, it's around 14% now in Brazil. And, the Brazilian real has appreciated quite a bit in the past 3 months. I mean, quite a bit, almost doubled, a little bit less, but, quite significantly. And so when people start feeling it in their pocketbooks, if people feel like they're not getting their jobs back because, the health crisis is not under control, if people are feeling like, their business is closed down, they can't reopen, support for him may start to wane.
Yeah, you were saying that people on the brink of poverty are now falling into extreme poverty. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, it's really sad.
Yeah, it's been very sad. It's over the past 20 years or so, Brazil has made great inroads in bringing in a middle class. I think something like 28 million Brazilians entered the middle class in the past 15 years or so, and but it remains a very unequal country. And in the past year, since 2020, 20 plus million have actually reverted back into poverty because of the pandemic. Now, I should say the government has 2 stimulus programs, which has, lessened the impact somewhat. But it's the first stimulus pack passed last summer with a number of direct, like in the U.S., stimulus checks direct to households, number of access to financing for small businesses, a number of different measures, and they just passed their second round very recently, but was a lot less. And so that staved off the worst, but my fear is that now that help has been reduced significantly, and COVID is getting worse, and what that could mean for poverty levels in Brazil and even more inequality, I think, is a very real concern.
It's just so staggering thinking about how much the pandemic has just reverted progress. Like, we talk about gender equality a lot and how it's been taken back anywhere between 36 and 96 years, depending on who you ask, by the pandemic. And, education, I mean, there's going to be so much, I mean, like, that's staggering to think that like the middle class could evaporate. I mean, it's really upsetting. And I wonder if also, I haven't really looked at India that much, but India is having similar problems with COVID, and they had a long time of trying to develop their middle class. And I wonder if that's going to be similar as well there.
Yeah, I think the jury's still out on all this. But I just think the U.S. returning to the multilateral institutions and increasing funding for some of the development banks will help to mitigate some of this fiscal pressure on Brazil and other developing countries. But it's not a rosy scenario from where we speak today on April the 7th.
What about you did mention that there actually has been a surge in small and medium enterprises in Brazil during the pandemic. And, can you talk about a little bit that and who's starting these businesses? What are they?
There's been a small uptick, I'd say, in 2020 over 2019, about 8 or 9% growth in SMEs, which is a good number. The important number is to know that about 98% of all enterprises in Brazil, all businesses in Brazil are actually small, medium-sized businesses. So it's an important engine of the economy. But that said, they face hurdles, and they continue to face hurdles over access to financing. And so there was growth during the pandemic. We saw a lot of growth in like fintech startups and companies or small businesses that maybe weren't online, making the switch quickly to online to be able to expand products and services and et cetera. I think that's why we saw some of that growth. And I should say a lot of the U.S. fintechs actually were responsible for some of that growth in Brazil, which is a nice story with, Stripe and WhatsApp payments and a bunch of other companies.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so that's been a good story. I would say that the flip side of that coin has been the loss of women-owned businesses in Brazil. And again, like everywhere in the world, women being the primary caretakers for the young, but as well as the elderly, have dropped out of the workforce, and that includes the small businesses that they've owned. So we've seen about 1.3 million women-owned businesses close in Brazil last year. Now, those that did survive, though, I have to say, proved to be more savvy with use of social media and launching new products. But the impact that women-owned businesses have felt has been, quite disproportionate to male-owned businesses in Brazil.
Really pronounced.
Yeah, which is too bad. So.
What do you think? I mean, can you talk a little bit about what you do for McLarty and what your kind of solutions are for Brazil economically?
Sure, absolutely. Happy to chat about that in our minutes here. So McLarty Associates, for those that don't know, we are a international consulting firm. We're based here in DC, but we have offices in Europe and all over Asia, in India as well. And we support multinational companies with their investment strategies outside the United States, and principally their government relations strategies. So the way I like to talk about sometimes is that, we don't really lobby the U.S., or I don't lobby the U.S., but we do lobby Brasilia and Buenos Aires and Santiago, and Lima and, Delhi, etc. So we represent foreign investors in all these jurisdictions, and not just with their government relations strategies, but we help them analyze and assess political risk, regulatory risk. We advise companies that are new to a market on, business climate issues, business culture issues. A lot of times we help corporations set up government relations teams in the country. We know we have contacts everywhere, so we're able to identify talent. I mean, we're not an HR recruiting firm, but through our networks, we're able to help them assemble and to shape government relations strategies that reflect what corporate wants. And so we often tend to serve as a bridge for our clients between local teams and headquarters. And I've been at McLarty for about 10 years. I mean, you went through my bio already, so I don't need to go through the professional bio, but I am Brazilian American. My mom is from Brazil. My father is from Chicago. I lived in Brazil when I was young, and actually my parents moved back to Brazil about 6 years ago. So my family lives actually all there, except for my family in Chicago. So
hopefully healthy and safe.
Yeah, everyone's healthy and safe, including in Brazil, my 104-year-old grandmother.
Wow.
Survived the Spanish flu and has yet to be impacted by COVID, and did get her vaccine in Brazil in February, so that was good.
Wow, that's staggering. Yeah. So what are you telling, investors that are interested in Brazil right now? What are you warning them?
Brazil actually, for all the challenges with COVID, it remains a bright spot in Latin America for foreign investment. It's a large domestic internal market, huge consumer class. There's a number of bright spots in Brazil for investment. Infrastructure is one. I mean, the government, Bolsonaro administration, has done a tremendous job putting into the pipeline a number of infrastructure projects, a number of privatization projects of utility companies, of banks, of different industries. I mentioned fintech. It's a ripe country for investment in fintech. The fintech industry, the Central Bank of Brazil, has done a phenomenal job, in this administration to rewrite the regulatory framework for fintech. So that's helped a lot, and that, of course, has spillover benefits, right, for small and medium-sized businesses in Brazil and the mom and pop stores. Energy continues to be, I think, renewable energy, especially in Brazil, is a very promising area for solar, for wind, for hydro. That is a big area. Mining continues to be, the legal mining, I should say, a bright spot as well. But our investors are in every sector. They kind of run the gamut. Some of the manufacturers, they're energy, they're healthcare. And so if if your expectations are aligned, and you know what to expect and how to do business in Brazil, you can be successful despite the many obstacles. And this government is actually trying to do the right thing. I mentioned earlier the reform agenda. There's a tax reform we're expecting this year. There's been a number of measures to improve trade and reduce barriers to trade in Brazil. And so that's helped a lot, I think, to make the outlook a little bit better than it would otherwise appear because of the health crisis.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to get that perspective because, like they say in the news, if it bleeds, it leads. And so everything is occupied now with, Bolsonaro firing people. And so it's interesting to hear, actually, like, especially you mentioned Argentina, which the economy is like in ruins, that Brazil is doing much better than Argentina from an economic perspective. And probably a better place to invest.
And Mexico is in Mexico. There's a lot of political risk in Mexico now as well too. So that has also, I think, put a spotlight on Brazil as sort of a good option when you look at Latin America.
Well, I want to thank you so much. Gabrielle has kids at home, so I don't want to keep her too long because we know who does caretaking.
They've been at bay. I'm so happy. We did that BBC interview moment where they're going to come out here.
But it's been such a delight having you. I want to thank you so much for giving us so much valuable information about Brazil, and also just really reflecting on those parallels between Brazil and the U.S. and what does the future of Brazil-U.S. relations look like. And I think it's also interesting that even though Bolsonaro is, more Trumpian, he does seem to want to work with Biden. He does seem to, that Brazil wants to come to the table. They're not just like, oh, you're not Trump, we're not working with you, see you later. Like Putin kind of has, frankly.
Right.
So I think that that's also a really interesting, important insight, and it's a good omen for the future of Brazil-U.S. relations.
I agree. And thank you for having me on the show. It's been a pleasure. And if anybody has questions about Brazil, wants to continue the conversation, you can ask Samantha. She knows where to find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. Have an amazing night.
Thanks. You too. Bye.
So that was Gabrielle Trabat, who's a managing director at McLarty Associates in Washington, D.C., a dual national of Brazil and the United States. Obviously, not just extremely bright, but extremely knowledgeable about everything going on there. And, important to think like, yes, okay, there's all of this. The whole system is collapsing. That is a big deal. We need to look at that, but that there's also so much happening in Brazil with regards to fintech and investment and growth, and just thinking about how diverse it is and what a big country it is. I mean, it's the biggest country in Latin America. So I want to thank Gabrielle. It was fantastic. And I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsor for today, Trillium Solutions. Trillium designs learning and development programming for places like Microsoft, so kind of a big deal. They do creative media production, marketing and branding, even website design, and it is run by the most amazing feminist leader that I know, Tori Graff, who is an absolute delight to work with. Her entire team is really fantastic, incredibly nice, and they just want to create products that help your staff to learn or help your company to shine. So I really want to thank Trillium Solutions for being a sponsor of Samantha Politics. I also want to thank our other sponsors, Stream Inspectors, who are also the amazing producers. All these beautiful graphics that you see. No, me and Gabrielle did not design them. They were designed by Zach and Megan and their amazing team. They're really the leaders in live stream production. So if you're looking for live streaming like this, I really encourage you to look at Stream Inspectors. Lastly, I run a women's leadership program. If you're interested in becoming a badass women leader like Gabrielle, go to empowerglobal.net. and click on online challenge. We are accepting applications right now for the April cohort, and there's only 3 spots left. And lastly, if you liked the show, if you got something from it, if you learned something, if you feel like you're coming out on the other side more knowledgeable, we would so much appreciate it if you showed that love by sharing it. Please like us on Facebook, or if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe on YouTube, share with your friends, your family, anybody, your Facebook group, your LinkedIn, wherever people share, on Twitter. We're really dedicated at this show to helping people become global citizens and become more aware of the rest of the world, because the US news can be so myopic and really only focus on America. And just like Gabrielle was saying, Trump had a big influence on Bolsonaro, and we're all interconnected. Climate change, you can't solve climate change as one country. You have to have countries working together and collaborating. So it's so important to understand these interlinkages and how all of our fates really rest on each other. This really is a globalized world that we're in now. And you can see that clear as day with the pandemic of we're all facing the same thing. You couldn't escape from the pandemic. So that's it for today, everybody. We'll be back next week at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time next Wednesday. And thanks a lot for tuning in. We'll see you next week.